Alright, what's going on everyone? Today we're going to be taking a look at the Warhammer 40k commander decks and briefly going over the deck's core strategies. While we don't have time to go over all 100 cards in each deck, I will leave a link in the description to the complete deck list if you're interested in that. Also, we will not be discussing the merits of Universes Beyond products. I know it's a divisive topic and I certainly have my opinions, but today I just want to provide this overview for those who need it. So let's start with Forces of the Imperium. The face commander is Inquisitor Greyfax, and the alternate commander is Marneus Calgar, and both put a heavy emphasis on going wide with tokens. Greyfax pumps your entire board and gives everything vigilance, and you can also use your plentiful tokens to tap down other people's creatures and create clue tokens. Marneus will draw a card whenever we create a token, and we can also pay 6 to make 2 tokens, which will in turn draw 2 cards. So we want to go wide with tokens. One way we can do that is with the squad mechanic, like we see on Ultramarines Honor Guard. It's a 4-mana 2/2 that will pump your board, give everything +1/+1, which isn't that exciting to begin with, but with Squad, each extra 2 mana that you pay when you cast it is going to create a token copy of it. So not only will this help massively pump your board, but they'll even pump each other, right? So their own stats will be better when they're pumping each other. And this continues with things like Psycharigan Infiltrator, Vanguard Suppressor, Zephyrim. The first draws a card whenever it enters, meaning you'll draw a card for each token you make. And then of course, if you have Marneus Calgar, you'll draw 2 cards with the tokens. The suppressor has flying and draws whenever it damages a player, so that's awesome to have multiple copies of. And Zephyrim has flying, vigilance, and miracle, meaning when you draw it, you can reveal it and cast it for 2, making it very easy to create multiple copies with the squad mechanic. And remember, all of these tokens are going to get pumped by Greyfax or draw cards with Marneus Calgar. So you can see how this can get out of hand. You make lots of tokens, it's free value, potentially draw a bunch of cards, or just make them absolutely huge with vigilance. There are other ways to produce tokens as well, such as with Company Commander, Deploy the Front, and Launch the Fleet. The first will make a few tokens when it enters and gives things Death Touch when it attacks. Deploy the Front makes X 1/1 tokens, where X is the number of creatures in play, so that's pretty crazy. And Launch the Fleet can also put out a bunch of tokens when you attack, so lots of tokens. There's also plenty of payoffs for going wide, like Severina Rain, Thunderwolf Cavalry, Sanguine Priest. The first drains based on how many creatures we're attacking with, which of course is a lot when we're producing all these tokens. The cavalry can distribute a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures. All creatures get a counter when it hits the player, which is great again when we're going super wide. And the priest will deal 1 damage to anything whenever one of our creatures dies. Again, when we have who knows how many tokens in play, that can be kind of scary to kill our stuff. And there's plenty of more we don't have time to talk about. There's some crazy removal, some cool board sweepers that work with our strategy. There's more token producers, more payoffs, all kinds of stuff. But basically, we want to go super wide with lots of tokens and overwhelm our opponents with sheer numbers. That sounds fun to you? Check out Forces of the Imperium. Next, we'll take a look at Tyranid Swarm. The face commander is the Swarm Lord, and the alternate commander is Magus Lucia Kane. The first enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each time we've cast our commander. Bear in mind, the first time we cast it, it's going to be a 7/7, right? You'll get 2 for free. And then whenever a creature with a counter on it dies, we draw a card, which is pretty great. Lucia Kane, on the other hand, lets you distribute a +1/+1 counter at the beginning of combat, and then it can tap for 2 mana, and if you cast an X mana spell or ability, you create a copy of it. So basically, we want to make a big board with +1/+1 counters and ramp. We like big stuff, really. That's it. We like big, giant stuff. And the unique keyword for this deck is Ravenous, as you see with Broodlord. So it has X in its cost, and if you pay 5 or more, you get to draw a card. And then in this card's case, we also get to distribute X counters on other creatures we control. So you kind of see how this works, right? Swarm Lord just likes the counters, and we get to draw cards when we play Ravenous stuff because it has counters, and Lucia Kane can help pay for these big X cost spells, and there's a lot of them. Ravener, Tyranid Swarm, Zoanthrope. Did I mention I don't play Warhammer and I have no clue how to pronounce this stuff? Apologies, but yeah, the first has Flash, and you can force a creature to attack another player, right? You play it on someone else's turn, make them attack with something. Swarm spits out a bunch of tokens when it dies, and the Zoanthrope thing will deal X damage when it enters, so you can pump tons of mana into these, make huge creatures, and you get all these extra effects. And there's plenty more too, by the way. There's Exocrine, Malloc, Turvigen. I don't know how these pronounced, but I don't have time to go over all of these, but this is what this deck is doing. Big X cost creatures. And in order to take advantage of these, we need to ramp. So not only do we get a lot of traditional ramps like Rampant Growth, Cultivate, Harrow, all familiar ramp spells, but we also get some powerful stuff like Nexos, Biophagist, Sporocyst. Nexos lets your basics tap for 2 if you're casting an X cost spell, so that's pretty crazy. Basically double your mana for all your basics. Biophagist is a mana dork, but it adds a counter to anything we cast with it, which is, again, what we're doing. Deck's all about ramping and getting counters, so that's perfect. And Sporocyst is another X mana creature, but you get to search your library for X lands. Costs double X, but whatever you pay, you get to get half that many lands straight onto the battlefield. So that's pretty cool. And keep in mind, even though we have all these big X cost spells, this is also just like a +1/+1 counters deck. The Swarm Lord wants to see counters and draw cards when things die, and Lucia Kane still distributes counters. So we have a ton of cards that generate counters like Malanthrope, Tyranid Prime, Haruspex. The first exiles a graveyard when it enters, and then gets a +1/+1 counter for each creature exiled. The Tyranid Prime not only has Evolve, but gives all of our other creatures Evolve, meaning all of our creatures are going to get +1/+1 counters whenever they see a bigger creature entering, so that's interesting. And the Haruspex gets a counter whenever it sees another creature die, and then it can remove those to generate mana to make even bigger, X cost creatures. And there are also +1 counter payoffs like Bread for the Hunt, Hardened Scales, Clamvus. The first will draw cards when we hit players with creatures that have counters on them. Hardened Scales adds extra counters to everything. And then Clamvus is kind of crazy. It gives each creature +1/+1 for each counter it has. So it effectively doubles the power and toughness of our X mana creatures, right? If we pay, 7 mana for something and it's a 6/6, with Clamvus, it's going to be a 12/12. And of course, there's tons of stuff we don't have time to talk about. There's more X mana creatures, there's more counters, matters stuff, all kinds of +1/+1 counter synergies. And the deck is basically all about giant X mana creatures, ramp, and reaping the benefits of having +1 counters on all of them. So if that sounds fun to you, keep an eye out for Tyranid Swarm. Next on our list is Necron Dynasties. The face commander is Surek, the Silent King, and the alternate commander is Emotek, the Storm Lord. Surek is a 3/4 flyer that will mill 3 cards when it attacks, and then you can return a creature or vehicle milled this way to your hand, so free cards kind of. And Emotek will make 2/2 creature tokens whenever it sees an artifact leaving the graveyard, and it also gives an artifact creature +2/+2 and menace at the beginning of combat. So this is a mono black self-milling artifact reanimator deck. We want to fill our deck with skeleton robots and then bring them back from the dead. The keyword for this deck is Unearth, as we see on Royal Warden. So when it enters, it makes 2 of those Necron tokens. We'll be seeing a lot of these, by the way. So it makes 2 Necron tokens, but then it has Unearth, meaning that once it dies, we can recast it from the graveyard. We'll have to sacrifice it at end of turn, but we still get 2 more of those Necron tokens, right? And this works really well with our commanders. It means that if we mill it with Surek, we're filling our graveyard with these Unearth things, right? Which we can then cast, and then we get value out of them. Like if we mill over a Royal Warden, even if we don't return it to our hand, we can cast it from our graveyard. It's a free card that we got that's also going to generate a couple tokens, and Imhotep will see these artifacts leaving the graveyard and make more of these Necron tokens, right? When we unearth Royal Warden with Imhotep in play, it sees the artifact leaving the graveyard and pops out a couple tokens itself. And remember, even though this is a black deck, most of the creatures are artifacts, as you'll see. Pay attention to the card type, lots of artifacts. So, the unearth keyword continues with things like Canoptek Tomb Sentinel, Skorpek Lord, and Ghost Dark. The first is basically a removal spell. It's a 4 mana, 4/3, pretty okay creature, but when we unearth it, we can exile any non-land permanent, which is pretty crazy. The Lord gives all of our artifact creatures +1/+0 in menace, which is great, and then the Ghost Ship will actually give every creature in our graveyard unearth 3. So not only does this allow us to cast everything from our graveyard, all of our creatures anyway, but it also will reduce the cost of our other unearthed stuff. Like this Sentinel, for example, it costs 7 to unearth it because it's a really good removal spell, but if we have the Ghost Dark, it'll have unearth 7 and unearth 3, and we can just pay the 3. So it's actually pretty cool. And we continue with this theme with things like Canoptek Spider, Convergence of Dominion, and Necron Monolith. The first will draw a card whenever a non-token artifact enters our battlefield, which is great because we're casting and recasting all of these artifacts, right? We cast something with Unearth, we get a card. We cast something from our graveyard, we get a card. Our commander is milling Unearth stuff into our graveyard and we're recasting it and just draw. Convergence will actually reduce the cost of all of our Unearth abilities by 2, and it also gives us a way to mill, so that's another way to get stuff into the graveyard. And the Monolith will mill 3 whenever it attacks, and it will make a 2/2 Necron for each creature we mill. So lots of advantages here for milling and reanimating. We want stuff to go in our graveyard and then we want to bring it back. We also have more reanimation in the form of Anakir the Traveler, Living Death, Technomancer. So the first lets you cast an artifact from your graveyard whenever you attack by paying life instead of mana. Still pretty good. Living Death will exile all graveyards, then wipe the board, then return all the creatures that it exiled to the battlefield. So basically it swaps creatures in play with creatures in the graveyard. Everything dies, and then everything that was already dead goes into play, which is great for us if we're behind because we're milling so many things into our graveyard that, if we don't have much on the board, we just swap and, we could have tons of stuff in our graveyard because that's what we're doing. And Technomancer is weird. So when it enters, we return 6 mana value total straight to the battlefield. It seems really bad, right? Because it's a 7 mana 5/1, but basically we are paying 7 mana for 6 mana value worth of stuff in our graveyard, and then that 1 extra mana is going towards a 5/1. So that's how you should look at it. The mana cost is really for all the stuff you're getting out of the graveyard, which isn't bad. There's also a ton of great artifact payoffs like Mystic Forge, Their Name is Death, and Biotransference. The first will let you look at the top card of your library and cast artifacts, which is really good value in an artifact deck. You just get to chain stuff off the top of your deck. Their Name is Death will wipe the board of all non-artifact creatures, which, do note, not only are we almost exclusively playing artifact creatures, but even our Necron tokens are artifacts. So yeah, it's a one-sided board sweep, pretty crazy. And speaking of Necron tokens, Biotransference will make us lose 1 life and spit out a Necron token every time we cast an artifact. And I also want to briefly mention Out of the Tombs. So every turn we put an Eon counter on it, and then we mill that many cards. You could easily, mill your entire deck out with this. It's kind of scary, but once you run out of cards in your deck, instead of drawing, you just reanimate something from the graveyard. It's kind of crazy, but it's also really dangerous because if your opponent empties your graveyard, you just lose. And if the enchantment gets destroyed, then you just die from milling out. So it's dangerous, but I just had to mention it just because it's kind of crazy and silly. But yeah, guys, there's lots more we don't have time to talk about. Lots of artifact and reanimation synergies. But if you like filling your graveyard with robot skeletons and reanimating them, Necron Dynasties might be the deck for you. Our final deck is the Ruinous Powers, which has Abaddon the Despoiler as the face commander and Be'lakor the Dark Master as the alternate. Abaddon wants you to deal damage to your enemies, and when you do, spells in your hand will have Cascade if they have mana value less than or equal to the amount of life they lost. So if you deal 5 damage to someone, everything that costs 5 or less will have Cascade. Be'lakor is a tribal demon commander. Not your entire deck has demons, so not sure if this is worth swapping, but when it enters, you draw X and lose X, where X is the number of demons you control, and whenever a demon enters the battlefield, you'll deal damage to any target. These are very different, and I think most of the deck is built around Abaddon, so we'll focus on that, but you do have a pretty cool tribal demon commander if you want that. So first off, we should explain Cascade. When you cast a spell like Noise Marine, you cascade, meaning you exile cards off the top of your library until you exile something that costs less than the Cascade spell. So in this case, it would be 4 or less, since Noise Marine costs 5. And then you get to cast that spell for free. It's just a free spell. And also note that you can have Cascade twice. So for example, if you deal 5 damage first and then play Noise Marine, Abaddon will give Noise Marine Cascade. And it already has Cascade, so you'll Cascade twice. And then the Noise Marine will deal damage based on how many spells you cast, and you cast the Cascade spells first, so that's free damage and also just more cascading. Then there are things that like it when you cast stuff from exile, like Poxwalkers, Keeper of Secrets, and the Lost and the Damned. Poxwalkers will return from your graveyard to the battlefield whenever you cast something from exile. Keeper of Secrets deals damage to target opponent equal to the spell's cost, and Lost and the Damned will make a 3/3 creature token. The important thing to remember is that when you cascade, you're casting the free spells from exile, which isn't from your hand, so it will trigger all of these. So that's what the deck is doing, right? It's a spell casting cascade deck? Well, no. Nope, that's not what it is. You see, I didn't understand this deck at first. I was looking through it, and I'm like, what the heck is this deck doing? I don't understand. And then I read the flavor text of Abaddon. You see, I don't play Warhammer. I don't know these things. Under his rule, there is but one creed. Chaos shall reign. And this reveals the true nature of this deck. This is a flavor deck. It is all about chaos. I mean, even Cascade itself is chaotic, right? You cascade, and who knows what you're gonna cast. And there's so much more. There's Chaos Warp, Chaos Mutation, Aspiring Champion. So the Chaos Warp will shuffle a creature into someone's library, and then they reveal cards off the top of their library until they hit a creature, and they put it onto the battlefield. Could be really good, could be really bad. Who the heck knows? Chaos Mutation does the same thing with multiple creatures, and Aspiring Champion does it to itself, basically. It sacrifices itself, and then you'll get another creature, who knows what. There's also Chaos Defiler, which destroys permanents at random, Night Rampager, which attacks players at random, and when it dies, it deals damage at random, and Mutilith, which has you flip a coin for each opponent, and then it has a random effect based on whether you win or lose. So if you win, you draw a card, and if you lose, they take 3 damage. So it's a heads I win, tails you lose situation. And the deck isn't just chaotic for you, the pilot. It also likes to sow chaos across the entire table. Seeker of Slanesh forces everyone to attack each combat. Karn the Betrayer is forced to attack or block every turn, but all damage dealt to it is prevented, and it constantly gets passed around the table. And Bloodthirster generates extra combat steps every time it hits a player, but you're forced to attack a different player with every combat step. So yeah, look, I don't know how good this deck is, but it is definitely flavorful. It's violent, it's chaotic, and who the heck knows what's going to happen. There's a ton of this in here, tons of randomness, tons of chaos. I think you play this deck if you just want to harass your friends. I mean, RNG could be in your favor and you could just go crazy, but I think the goal here is just sow chaos, randomness, mass destruction, blood for the blood god. Who knows what's going to happen, right? So yeah, if that sounds good to you, then maybe check out the Ruinous Power. So those are our 4 decks this time around. I will leave Amazon affiliate links in the description below, but I always encourage you not to click those and instead support your local game store if you have one. I will also leave links to the complete deck list, so check those out. And be sure to let me know in the comments below which deck you're most interested in. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.